So I'm Jessie Westoff. I'm actually the Diversity and Inclusion Manager at a company called Clover Health. We are a Medicare/technology company just down the street, and I'm grateful to be there because they want to talk about disability. And I'm grateful to be here because you want to talk about disability. So thank you for attending. I am also here to talk to you as someone with a disability. So one of my disclaimers is I will tell some of my own stories, but that is not because I have any special story necessarily or my story represents all disability. I just think it's important for us to own our own stories. And frankly, they're going to be more top of mind when I'm answering your questions. So why are we here today? What percentage, and actually I'm going to ask interactive questions, what percentage of the US population do you think identifies or really would qualify as having a disability? Okay, a lot of people looked this up. Yeah, it's about 20%. You'll hear 19 or 20. And that's a lot. So obviously 20% of the employed workforce has a disability, right? No, not even close. The unemployment rates are much higher for people with disabilities. And it ranges by disability, but that's problematic for many reasons. We're missing out on a lot of talent. Basically, a lot of the gap is due to biases, not actually skills. So that's why we want to be here today. We're going to go ahead and talk about, this is very large. We're going to go ahead and talk about, we're going to increase our understanding of disability in the workplace to really help shift to focusing on people and skills and away from disability. I cannot magically have all of us remove our biases around disability today, but I can hopefully help you become aware of your filters towards disability so that you are able to start catching yourself and changing biases. Okay? All right, so we're going to go ahead and start with some social views, some social constructs, basically, around disability. Then I'm going to ask you to reflect on your personal lens around disability. And finally, I'm going to ask you to commit to at least one next step. Sound good? Okay. What does disabled mean? This delightfully wordy slide is from the government. The EEOC has a pretty straightforward, though at times not as clear as you would think it would be, definition. I just want to focus on the fact they say a mental or physical condition that substantially limits a major life activity. They've done a great job of pointing out the obvious ones. Walking, talking. When we're talking about disability at work, it includes things like commuting, driving, being able to be in an open office environment in the Bay Area. That's a real big thing, and that's a challenge for a lot of people for different reasons. So it's important that we think beyond these pretty low-hanging fruit examples that are provided here. Why is talking about disability so hard? I won't make anyone answer that question, but is there any like kind of brave souls want to shout out why they think it's hard to talk about? Fear. That's one of the big ones. When you come with best intentions, sometimes that fear can stop you in your tracks. And that's true for a lot of diversity and inclusion topics, right? You don't want to offend someone. And when it comes to disability, you also don't want to break the law. So that can also make you a little nervous, right? You don't know what you can say. You don't know what is appropriate to say, things like that. Also, the word disability, remarkably unhelpful. Remarkably. You're using the same word to describe someone with a prosthetic leg, someone with a hearing impairment, someone with Lou Gehrig's. Those are very different things. Those are very different life experiences. Even two people with prosthetic legs are going to have very different situations and very different abilities and accommodation needs, if any. All right, so sorry about that. That's the word we're given, but it is problematic in that sense. So that makes things nervous. There's also stigma around these conversations, right? It's a little taboo. You don't want to, it's that fear that kind of gets in the way. And we don't have models of these conversations. Because we don't have a lot of representation of disability in pop culture, for example, politics, we don't see conversations around disability. We don't have examples to model ourselves after, right? And that's how we do a lot of our learning, right? TV mostly, Facebook. So if you don't see these conversations, you feel even more nervous, all right? I will say these are all okay. They're not great, but we can still move forward and have conversations anyway. My big goal, I think, in life as someone who does this work and just a person is to get people comfortable with being uncomfortable. No one ever died from just feeling kind of uncomfortable right now. Feeling kind of uncomfortable is okay. I feel kind of uncomfortable most of the time, and I just kind of power through. Sometimes it's too much, I step outside, but that's okay, right? If I didn't push through to those moments, I would not be anywhere close to where I am today, all right? Really quick note on language before I move on to the next slide. You'll hear me use people with disabilities. You'll hear me use disabled people. The general preference is people with disabilities, person first language. But another reason this is hard is because even within the community, we don't agree on the language to use. Some people actually prefer disabled person. Some people prefer person with a disability. You're less likely to kind of step on someone's toes with person with a disability. You can say whatever you want to me. I've got enough privilege. You are not going to offend me. As long as you are talking to me and engaging with me on disability, I am a happy Jessie. All right? So I will be your safe space today. All right, this next slide touches upon a different angle. So hopefully this really validates for people kind of why this is hard. That's something I really wanted to do today is be like, yes, it is hard, and we're still going to do it. But we don't really talk about the other side of the conversation very often. What's it like for the person with the disability? It's also very uncomfortable. I'm in my mid-30s. I still do not like having these conversations with my boss. I started a job in January. I'd say about 2 months before I started, when I got the offer, I was already like nauseous over having this conversation with my boss. It's just not fun because you know the biases. And here's an example of the biases. How many of you have heard of Harvard's implicit bias test? Perfect. So for those of you who don't know, pretty easy to Google Harvard implicit bias, and you can take tests on different biases, including around ability. This is directly from theirs, so I will read a little bit of it out because it's nice and fuzzy on the giant screen. The first 3 bars that are purple, those are all people who have a strong, moderate, or slight preference for abled people over disabled people. That's their wording. That's a lot of the population. Can you imagine if you're someone with a disability who feels like they need to have a conversation about it, what that feels like? Is not good. It's very overwhelming. It's a lot of weight. I feel like it's a lot of weight on my shoulders, quite frankly. I spent 3 years of my life only wearing pants, babysat for someone for 3 years. They did not know I had a prosthetic leg because I just was so nervous about the bias. That covering is intense. I do not recommend it. But we have to go in survival mode sometimes when we see these overwhelming statistics. So hopefully we can get more and more people to lessen those big purple bars, move into this no preference 14%, or this very small 9% at the bottom for people who prefer disabled over abled. Again, if 19% of the population has a disability and we only see 9% of the population has a preference for disabled over abled, either their sample was not representative of the US population, which is definitely possible, or it really shows even people with disabilities can have biases as well. So we're gonna talk about some common society mindsets, these social models of how disability is viewed. The first one is the medical model. I'm very happy to say this is generally outdated in the United States, but it still does show up sometimes. It's very prevalent in like the 19th century in the United States. Disabled people are patients. That's all they are. They're patients. They're in centers and they're not in public spaces because there's a lot of shame around having a disability, around having a family member with a disability, so they go into a center, end of story. Again, we've moved on a little bit in most cases, but you can still sense this. There's still family dynamics around this. The tragedy model. People with disabilities are unfortunate. We need to take care of them. We need to protect them. They do not need to work. We will take care of them. And it's very socially positive of us to take care of them and show that. This model really would be, a good example would be a religious organization doing some charity work. That does not mean a religious organization should not do that charity work. There's obviously a lot of benefits there. But I do want to show that there's limitations to each of these models as well. I would love to not work. However, I am very able to work, for example. as my family's told me. So, and then the social model, this is a bit more contemporary. And by the way, these 3 models are by far the most prevalent. You'll see, you can find TED Talks on all of these pretty easily. The social model, disability is a consequence of the environment. It is not my body that's the issue. It is that stair for me to get in, blocking me from getting into the building. That is that issue. It's a really legal framing. It basically divides people into buckets and makes sure legally people can access everything regardless of the bucket. All right? So how many of you, and I'm not going to ask you which one, how many of you feel like your view of disability fits cleanly into one of these buckets? Couple people. How many of you feel like your view of disability is either not at all represented here or kind of goes into a couple of the buckets? Right? So that's another reason why it's kind of like we as a society are kind of all over the place in the ways in which we think about disability. So that's why kind of someone doing my work, it's kind of hard to strategize, right? But if you figure out what your general view of disability is, then we can start to think about how we can basically improve it to empower people more. Okay? All right. Because what is missing even from the social model? Everyone has a story. My story is different than your story, which is different than your story, which is different than your story, even if we all have the same disability. We have stories. We're human beings. We're not just legal buckets, right? The personal impact, and I like to talk about confidence for a very specific reason. This is in no way, shape, or form saying that people with disabilities cannot be confident. I am confident. I have a disability. There you go. But there is something very, very powerful about someone constantly expressing their doubt in you because of your disability. Some people might have experienced this because of their race, because of their gender, some other part of their identity. This is not unique to disability. But I've literally had a boss say to me after I'd gotten a high marking on my last performance review, I don't see how you can do your job because of your disability. That's hard to get around. That's hard to power through. When you have an executive telling you that, and you're just kind of at a loss, right? So even someone who's competent kind of starts to feel a little disoriented in those moments. So I think that's important to call out for underrepresented groups in general. The emotional stages of your own understanding. So I have had a prosthetic leg since I could walk. When did I first identify as disabled? And I was like, I'm looking to my best friend. I was like, how old was I? When I was in my mid-20s. It took me being on a walkabout in the Australian outback for 8 hours, which was not great. Magical, but also horrible. Literally like this, panting, and I just kind of shouted out like, I have limitations. Like, that was my moment. That was my breakthrough moment after doing marching band and ballet and soccer. It took really being a little irresponsible with my body to just be like, oh, I see. There are things I need to think about a little bit differently before I throw my body into 8-hour walkabouts in the Australian bush. So we're all in different places of identifying with different words that people might put on us, right? It's for us to identify with. So different stages of your own understanding. Also, there's this reality of disabilities actually often come later in life. And not everyone wakes up one day and suddenly the disability's there and they're like, cool, got it, disabled. There's a lot of emotional processing for something like that, right? And there's also the pressure of educating others. How many of you have ever felt the pressure to educate others about some factor of your identity? Isn't it fun? It's not exhausting at all. So that's real. And I do diversity and inclusion work, right? And I know a couple of you do too. Sometimes even in that job, I'm not up for it 100%. So if that's not your job, I do not expect you to be up for it most of the time. If you have that in you and you want to do that, I fully support you. If you don't want to do that, do not do that. That is not your job. But another thing that these models leave out is that reality that a lot of us in underrepresented groups face. So these are all kind of more the human parts that aren't really in these social models, right? All right, so now that we've talked about those high-level models, I'd really like people to think about their own experiences and their own filters. So we talked about what bucket you think you fall into, but I'm going to take it to a little bit more of a personal level. given the topic of today's event, this is a bit of a risk, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. For those of you who are able, if you could please all stand up. And if you're not able, just take a seat. Sit down. If you do not have any friends or coworkers, with a good friend coworker, like that coworker when you have a bad day, you like kind of go get coffee with real quick so you don't like cry at work, you know, hypothetically. If you don't have a friend or a coworker that you know to have a disability, if you don't have anyone, sit down. If you have one person in this category, go ahead and sit down. 2 people in this category, go ahead and sit down. 3. We're going to go up to 7. All right, you can all sit down. Thank you very much. So even in this room where we all, there's a higher chance probably that we know, like there's a person that we're here for today, whether it's ourselves or someone else. A lot of the room sat down after 1. So you have 1 person representing your understanding of the personal disability experience at best. That's why you have to kind of rely on stereotypes. You're still feeling the fear. You're still kind of nervous. But I've got solutions to this. To dive a little deeper even, think of that person, regardless of when you sat down, that you're the closest with. Who do you know the best? Now think about, what do you know about their disability? This is hypothetical. You don't have to shout this out. What do you know about their disability? When did the disability start? Do they talk about their disability with a lot of people? How do they feel about talking about their disability with people? That's a big one, right? I feel very differently with some people than other people, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be true for a lot of people about pretty much any personal topic, right? So sometimes we think, oh yeah, I know someone with a disability, but do you really know? Do you really know how that affects them? I don't know. You might. Regardless, exposure is important, and I want everyone to try to continue to grow their exposure. I'll give you a couple ways to at the end. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go to a quick video. This is a great TED Talk. It's pretty easy to find. If you do like TED, disability, Lisa with an E, then you'll go ahead and find it. We're going to start a little bit into it, and real quick, a little bit of context. She's South African, and they actually do have a government mandate that you have 7% of your employees have a disability. So she's going to refer to something that context will help to know. All right, thank you.
We can't judge people based on our stereotype understandings. So I asked the question, why is it that people still approach me with that sing-song pity voice and give me the cognitive credibility of a 5-year-old? And they come and say, hello, and what's your name? I mean, just the other day, flying up to Joburg, it was this week, in fact, I get lifted off the little skinny chair and I get put onto the seat, and they take the wheelchair away, and this lady leans over and she goes, Shame, lovey, are you okay? So I said, yes, I'm fine, thank you. She goes, oh, shame. And then she says, are you going to Johannesburg on holiday? And I said, no, I'm going up on business just for the day. Wait, you work? And I said, I do. And she goes, you know, it just shows you people are so brave. And I look and I think, really? I'm not a firefighter. I'm just going to work, really. You get credibility for doing absolutely nothing. I'm buying a pumpkin the other day at Fruit and Veg City, and someone told me I was courageous. And I said, well, what's wrong with the pumpkin? And you kind of got to ask yourself, why is it that I'm getting credibility here for not doing much? So you give it a bit of thought and you realize it's because people have set very low benchmarks of expectations for people with disabilities. So if you do something normal, people go, wow, you champion. And you go sort of going, not so much, really. Okay, and why is this? It's because we don't understand disability, because we see the disability and we judge people's abilities based on that. Okay, now the problem in the workplace is if you have low benchmarks, then you don't see the value that the person can actually add to your organization. So what happens is you panic a bit. So the Labour Department goes, you must reach your 2%. And you go, all right, and you dash out and you go, but, ooh, yeah, I don't know about this, because we're a very busy department. Can't really have disabled people here. It's too dynamic, it's too busy. Because you're judging it on your understanding of someone sitting in a wheelchair with a crochet blanket, perhaps pushing a bolt on a nut. That's not disability. And the other problem with that is we tend to assign which jobs we feel are suitable for people with a disability. So the starting strategy of a company doing a disability inclusion process is we go, well, now which positions are suitable for the disabled? And usually it's like switchboard, call center. Okay, and my question is, do you also say, well, which positions in our company are suitable for black people? When you say that, people go, hey, that's not right, that's discriminatory. And I go, well, why? Well, because in the category of black people, so to speak, there is such a vast arrangement of different potentials and skills and knowledge and personalities and motivation. So you can't say which positions are suitable for black people. So why is it okay to decide which positions are suitable for disability and people with a disability? It's because you are thinking blind, deaf, and in a wheelchair. So you're thinking from a functionality perspective. Well, the reality is disability includes a huge, wide range of impairments which may or may not disable you, depending on what context you're operating in, right? So here's the thing. We're 22 years down the line towards democracy, and we're still no closer to integrating people with a disability. In fact, in some provinces, the representation in the workplace has actually dropped. So not only are we not getting...
So I do hate to cut it off because it is a really good talk. I highly recommend you follow up with that talk. Did you like that video? Yeah. I think she kind of wraps a lot of this into a nice, humorous blanket. I particularly like the pumpkin story. But this is real. This happens a lot. I was interviewing an HR director candidate, and I need someone in my current job to help me find sourcing for disability for hiring. Project Hired is here, FYI. And so I asked them, I was like, so they were very proud to say, we did focus on hiring people with disabilities. And I said, how did you approach that? They're like, well, obviously there's some jobs they can't do, so we identified the jobs, and in my head I was like, that's exactly what you don't do. And so I asked, I said, can you give me an example of a job that wasn't suitable for someone with disabilities? And they said, like driving a truck, for example. I can drive a truck. You can drive a truck. I know her, so I know she can drive a truck. But that really, I thought, was a powerful example of someone with a lot of experience in human resources still had that wheelchair view, one look about disability. So it's really important we question that. All right, so where do we go from here? I'm not just going to give you a lot of depressing news and leave the stage. There is hope. We definitely can do something about this. So I am proposing the empowering model. You will not find a lot of information about this social model on disability. So I'm happy to share it with you, and you can share the word further. How many of you like to feel empowered? Right? How many of you like to feel in control? Maybe too much? Still, it's really important, right? How many of you like to make your own decisions? Right? That's huge. That's huge. That feeling of autonomy and control over your own life and decisions is really huge. Those models we talked about before are a little problematic for some, to different degrees for these things. So really making their own decisions, that can apply to, I choose to apply for this job. I'm not going to apply for a job that I don't think I can do for whatever accommodation reason, right? I've made that choice. I'm in control of that. You do not have to decide that for anyone. It can also be for people's medical situations, like I choose what doctor I go to, I choose which care option I have. We're getting better about that in America, luckily, though we still have a long way to go. Questions on this model? It's simple, which I like, but can also lead to questions, so feel free to have some at the end too. So I would love to ask everyone to commit to one of these steps. Think about empowering others. Think about putting them in control of their own decisions. You can take the implicit bias test. We will go ahead and send this out to participants, by the way, but you're also welcome to take a screenshot, a phone picture. Take that test. It's okay if you don't like what you see. It's just important to have a reality check with yourself, right? Only you are going to see the screen, so it's fine. I'm not going to see your screen. You're fine. And even if I did, I would not judge you. Those tests are really important to help us understand our views. If you want to just look more about the legal definitions, if this information is particularly relevant to your role, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has some resources there to learn about how your company can be a leader in disability inclusion. The US BLN, it's the US Business Leaders Network, is pretty much the leading organization. It's at least nationwide. I think they actually might be global. And they have a certification program your company can do if you really want to go if you're a big enough company. They started a couple years ago their Disability Equality Index. How many of you have heard of the Corporate Equality Index? Right, so maybe not the best analogy, but it's pretty self-explanatory. You do pay a small fee to participate in it, but they give you all the questions for free so you can still do your own benchmarking. So if you really don't know where to start there. It's really approachable. Download those questions and dive in. This is my favorite suggestion. How many of you have heard of the show Speechless? I am doing a great service then. So the show Speechless is in my opinion, one of the most important shows right now. It's up like top 3 in my mind. So it is a story of a family. It's a sitcom. And they have 3 kids. One of them, it's a mother, father, 3 kids. One of the kids has a disability. All of the characters are caricatures except for the kid with the disability. He is a normal teenager, and it's awesome. He is a punk sometimes. He's like a total brother, right? But they, especially in season 1, were very unapologetic about approaching real topics. This idea that someone's inspirational just because they're in a wheelchair, for example. They really go in it. There are multiple writers with disabilities in that room. I promise you that. So it's on Hulu, I believe, still. It's good. It's also just really funny. So I highly recommend that. I do obviously think humor is a good way to approach knowledge and situations. So definitely love that. I actually recently added this. Follow Able Thrive on Facebook. It's exposing me to a lot of great, cool knowledge. They had a campaign called, like a hashtag, like this is how I, and it was people showing like, this is how I get in and out of my car. This is how I get dressed in the morning. Just really simple things like that that humans are going to be curious about, but are not appropriate to ask someone personally, right? And people opt into it. They volunteer to do those videos if they're interested in doing those videos, right? So I love that. And for all things workplace accommodations are really hard for people because it feels overwhelming. They're actually not so bad. Go to askjan.org. And you will find a very thorough resource, like maybe a little overwhelmingly thorough sometimes, down to basically disability. It's got a page summarizing reasonable accommodations for interviews. It is a great cheat sheet. I don't even try to memorize anything. I go to Ask Jan. All right? And I will say if someone's asking for an accommodation and you're not sure if it's reasonable, it's probably reasonable. If they're asking for like a $20,000 chair, maybe not so reasonable. But usually, most accommodation requests are under $500 or free. So, all right. So one last thing about allyship and why it's so important for you to be here. There's a study that talks about if someone is advocating for diversity and inclusion in their company, what is the impact what impact does that have on their own career development and the way they're viewed in the company? And here's the delightful reality. Ethnic minority or female leaders who engage in diversity valuing behavior are penalized with worse performance ratings, whereas ethnic majority or male leaders who engage in diversity valuing behavior are not penalized for doing so. Study, in fact, points out they're often rewarded. So that's fun. But it's for people like use your privilege. Even if you have an identity that's often oppressed, like I, for example, have a disability, but I can stand up here and talk to you today because I am fortunate enough to have had the career that I've had, and I want to use that privilege. So never underestimate the power of what you have to offer. All right, so this also applies to disability, I'm sure, and I really appreciate people taking the time to consider this presentation today. Thank you so much.